The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the governor's office, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation as the newly appointed state police chief sat in a high-backed leather chair, his posture straight but relaxed. At 45, he carried himself with quiet confidence, earned through years of dedicated service in law enforcement. The governor, a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair, leaned forward at her desk, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Your track record speaks for itself," she said warmly. 20 years of service, multiple commendations, and an unwavering commitment to community policing. That's exactly what our state needs right now. The new chief nodded thoughtfully, his fingers lightly drumming on the armrest. He was making history today as the first black state police chief in Massachusetts, but his mind was already racing with plans for the future. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. He'd worked his entire career for an opportunity like this. "Thank you, Governor," he replied, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came naturally after 2 decades on the force. "But we both know there's a lot of work ahead of us." The governor rose from her desk and walked to the window, gazing out at the state house grounds below. "You're right about that," she agreed, turning back to face him. "Our department needs change. The community's trust in law enforcement is at an all-time low. The statistics on racial profiling are troubling, to say the least." The chief's eyes followed her movement, remembering his own experiences both as a rookie officer and as a black man in America. "I've seen it from both sides," he said quietly. "And that's exactly why I want to handle my first week differently." The governor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What did you have in mind?" He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I'd like to start unofficially. No press announcements, no formal introduction. I want to observe our officers in their natural environment, see how they really interact with the community when they think nobody's watching." A smile played at the corners of the governor's mouth. "That's unconventional. But I like it. You want to see the unvarnished truth." "Exactly," he replied, standing up. "Real change can't happen until we understand the real problem. Not just what shows up in reports or what people say in meetings." The governor walked over to her desk and picked up a leather folder containing his official appointment papers. "You know this won't be easy," she said, her tone serious. "You'll be facing resistance from all sides. Change never comes without pushback." The chief accepted the folder, his expression resolute. "Nothing worth doing ever is, Governor. But I believe in our officers. Most of them are good people who want to do the right thing. Sometimes they just need better guidance, better training, and a reminder of why they put on the badge in the first place." He paused, looking down at the folder in his hands. Inside were the papers that would officially make him responsible for over 1,000 officers and the safety of millions of citizens. "I've seen what good policing can do for a community," he continued. "I've also seen what happens when trust breaks down. My goal isn't just to fix problems, it's to build something better." The governor nodded approvingly. "That's why you were our first choice. You see the bigger picture." As they walked toward the office door, the chief shared more of his vision. "I want to start with the basics, review our training programs, look at our community engagement initiatives, examine our accountability measures. But first, I need to understand what's really happening on our streets." The governor stopped at the door, extending her hand. "Well then, Chief, I wish you luck with your unofficial first week." There was a twinkle in her eye as she added, "Just try not to get into too much trouble before your official start date." The chief smiled, shaking her hand firmly. "I'll do my best, Governor. But sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected places." As he walked through the grand corridors of the State House, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors, the chief's mind was already working through his plans. He thought about his family, his wife who'd supported him through every step of his career, his kids who'd grown up understanding both the pride and the challenges of being a law enforcement family. He reached his car in the parking lot, a modest vehicle that didn't broadcast his position or success. That was exactly how he wanted it. For the next few days, he would be just another citizen on the streets of Massachusetts. No special treatment, no official recognition, just a man driving home to his family. Little did he know that this decision would lead to an encounter that would shape his entire approach to reforming the department. As he drove home, the weight of his new badge sitting in the leather folder on the passenger seat, He couldn't have predicted how soon his commitment to change would be tested, or how a simple traffic stop would become the catalyst for transformation within his department. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. It was the end of one chapter in his life and the beginning of another. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them, one day at a time, one change at a time, starting with a simple observation. Sometimes the best way to lead is to first understand what it feels like to follow. 3 days before his official start date, the new chief decided to celebrate with his family at their favorite restaurant. It was a small Italian place they'd been going to for years, long before his recent appointment. The kind of family-owned spot where the owners knew their regulars and the garlic bread came endless and hot from the oven. His wife had insisted on the dinner, saying they needed to celebrate properly before life got even busier. Their teenage kids had agreed enthusiastically, though he suspected it had more to do with the restaurant's famous tiramisu than any particular interest in his career milestone. The evening had been perfect, full of laughter, stories, and those precious moments that make family dinners special. His daughter had talked about her upcoming science fair project, while his son shared his latest basketball game highlights. His wife kept giving him proud glances across the table, her eyes twinkling in the warm restaurant lighting. Now, driving home in his Honda Civic, he couldn't wipe the smile from his face. The car was nothing fancy, 7 years old, a few minor scratches on the bumper, and that mysterious squeak in the front wheel he'd been meaning to get checked. But it was reliable, practical, and most importantly, it was paid off. He'd always believed in living within his means, showing his kids that success wasn't about flashy possessions, but about character and hard work. The night was clear and cool, with a quarter moon hanging in the sky like a half-finished thought. The highway was relatively empty at this hour, just the occasional truck rumbling past and the steady hum of his tires on the asphalt. He'd chosen to take the longer route home, enjoying the peaceful drive and mentally preparing for the week ahead. His casual clothes, a comfortable sweater and well-worn jeans, felt right for the evening. He'd left his suit jacket at home, wanting to just be himself tonight, a father and husband celebrating with his family rather than the incoming state police chief. The silver wedding band on his finger caught the occasional glint from passing streetlights, reminding him of all the years of support that had led to this moment. As he drove, his mind wandered to the changes he hoped to implement in the department. Community outreach programs, better training protocols, new accountability measures. The list was long, but necessary. He believed in the power of small changes adding up to big transformations. It was something his own father, a former postal worker, had taught him. Do the right thing every day and eventually the right thing becomes the normal thing. The radio played softly in the background, an old soul tune that reminded him of Sunday afternoons in his childhood home. His mother would be so proud if she could see him now. She'd passed away 2 years ago, but he could still hear her voice. Baby, remember where you came from, and never forget where you're going. He checked his speed regularly, exactly at the limit. Old habits die hard, and 20 years of law enforcement had ingrained in him a deep respect for traffic laws. Besides, he thought with a slight smile, what kind of example would the new chief set if he got pulled over for speeding? The dashboard clock read 10:45 p.m. His wife and kids had taken their own car home earlier, as their daughter had an early morning swim practice. He'd stayed behind to chat with the restaurant owner, an older gentleman who'd shared some surprisingly insightful thoughts about community relations. People just want to be treated with respect, the owner had said while wrapping up some leftover garlic bread. That's all. Simple as that. The highway stretched ahead, dark except for the steady rhythm of streetlights and the occasional glow of exit signs. He was about 20 minutes from home now, in that quiet stretch of road where the suburban sprawl gave way to more sparsely populated areas. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating reflective markers and the occasional scurrying wildlife. He adjusted his rearview mirror, a habit born from years of patrol work. Through it, he could see a pair of headlights in the distance behind him, growing larger as they approached. Something about their speed made him pay attention. Another old habit that had served him well over the years. The heat in his car was set just right, fighting off the early spring chill. He'd removed his sweater earlier and rolled up his sleeves, comfortable in his white button-down shirt. His police academy ring sat on his right hand, a reminder of where his journey had started and how far he'd come. As the headlights behind him grew closer, he noticed they were moving faster than the usual traffic on this stretch. He moved to the right lane, giving them plenty of space to pass. Instead, they followed his lane change. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. He'd made enough traffic stops in his career to know what was coming. Sure enough, moments later, red and blue lights flickered to life in his rearview mirror. He let out a slow breath, his earlier smile fading into a more contemplative expression. As he carefully signaled and pulled over to the shoulder, he couldn't help but think that this might be exactly the kind of unvarnished look at his department that he'd wanted. Though perhaps, he thought as he placed both hands visible on the steering wheel, not quite in the way he'd expected. The flashing lights painted the interior of his Honda Civic in alternating splashes of red and blue. He could feel his heartbeat quicken slightly, not from fear, but from years of understanding what could go wrong in situations like these. The shoulder of the highway was narrow here, and he pulled over as far as possible to ensure everyone's safety. His hands remained steady on the steering wheel, positioned at 10 and 2 o'clock. Through his side mirror, he watched two officers emerge from their patrol car. Their approach wasn't by the book. They split up, one on each side of his car, flashlights held high and aimed directly at his mirrors. 20 years of police work told him this wasn't standard procedure for a routine traffic stop. The beam of light swept across his face, intentionally blinding. He didn't squint or raise his hands to block it, knowing any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. Instead, he kept his expression neutral, his posture open and non-threatening. The wind from passing cars made his vehicle rock slightly, reminding him of how exposed they all were on this dark stretch of highway. "Evening, officers," he said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. He could see now that both officers were younger, probably in their early 30s. Their badges caught the light from overhead street lamps, numbers clearly visible. He made mental note of them, a habit ingrained from his early days in internal affairs. The officer at his window spoke first, his tone carrying an edge that seemed unnecessary for a simple traffic stop. "License and registration." Not a question, not even a complete sentence. Just a demand, lacking the professional courtesy that should be standard procedure. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" His question was polite but direct, exactly how he trained countless officers to handle civilian interactions. He knew his rights, but he also knew the delicate dance of these encounters. The flashlight beam didn't waver. License and registration first. The officer's partner had circled around to the passenger side, peering through the windows with his own light, creating disorienting beams that crossed in the car's interior. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached for his wallet. "I'm going to get my license from my back pocket," he narrated his actions, another habit born from experience. "Then I'll reach for my registration in the glove compartment." The officer on the passenger side tapped the window with his flashlight. "Pretty nice car for this neighborhood." The comment hung in the air, loaded with implications. The chief felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, not anger, but a deep, tired recognition. He handed over his license and registration, documents that told part of his story, his address in a middle-class suburb, his clean driving record, his status as a law-abiding citizen. But they didn't tell the whole story. They didn't show his 20 years of service, his recent appointment, or the gold shield that sat in a leather folder on his desk at home. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer commanded, hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. It was another unnecessary escalation, another departure from protocol. "Officer, I haven't been told why I was pulled over," he tried again, keeping his voice level. "I'd like to understand the reason for this stop." It was a reasonable request, one that any citizen had the right to make. The response came quick and sharp. "Sir, when an officer tells you to exit the vehicle, you exit the vehicle." The emphasis on "sir" carried a tone he'd heard too many times before from both sides of the badge. He complied, moving with the same slow deliberation. The night air was cooler now, and a semi-truck roared past, causing his tie to flutter. Standing beside his car, he was acutely aware of how this scene might look to passing motorists, two officers, hands near their weapons, confronting a black man on a dark highway. "Spread your legs, hands on the hood," the second officer instructed, moving in to conduct a pat-down. The chief complied again, feeling the cold metal beneath his palms. He noticed how the officer's hands were trembling slightly during the search, nervous energy poorly concealed beneath a mask of authority. As they ran his information through their system, he studied their faces in his side mirror. Young, inexperienced, maybe 5 or 6 years on the force at most. Their postures screamed insecurity masked by aggression, exactly the kind of behavior his training reforms would need to address. The radio crackled in their patrol car, and he could hear dispatch running his license. In a few moments, they would find nothing, no warrants, no violations, no reason for suspicion. But the damage was already done. Every procedural violation, every unnecessary escalation, every subtle and not so subtle display of bias was etched in his memory. Standing there in the cold, watching these officers demonstrate exactly why he'd been appointed to his new position, he felt an odd sense of purpose. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was a lesson unfolding in real time, a perfect example of everything that needed to change in his department. Little did these officers know that their actions tonight would become a powerful teaching moment. Not for punishment or shame, but for growth and transformation. As another car passed by, its headlights illuminating the scene briefly, he remained patient. Sometimes the best lessons come from the most uncomfortable moments, and he had a feeling this night was far from over. The officer's boots crunched on the gravel as they walked back to where he stood, still leaning against his car's hood. Their demeanor had shifted subtly. A mix of frustration and suspicion that he'd seen countless times before. The license check had come back clean, of course, but that seemed to only fuel their determination to find something wrong. "Pop the trunk," the taller officer ordered, flashlight beam still trained unnecessarily on his face. The command wasn't a request, and it wasn't supported by probable cause. Both facts hung in the air between them, unspoken but heavy with meaning. "Officers," he began, his voice carrying the steady calm of experience. "I'd like to understand the reason for this stop and search. I've been cooperative, but I have a right to know why I'm being detained." He straightened up slowly, maintaining a non-threatening posture while meeting their gaze with quiet dignity. The second officer stepped closer, his hand still resting on his holstered weapon. "You were swerving back there," he claimed, though both men knew it wasn't true. "We're just doing our job, making sure everything's in order." The pause before those last words carried an implication that made the chief's jaw tighten slightly. A car passed by slowly, its passengers obviously rubbernecking at the scene. The chief thought about how this must look, him in his business casual attire, hands visible, being confronted by 2 increasingly aggressive officers. It was a scene playing out too often on too many roads across the country. "I wasn't swerving, officer, and I think we both know that," he replied, keeping his tone professional but firm. "I'd like your badge numbers, please." It was a reasonable request, one that any citizen had the right to make, but it was met with immediate resistance. The taller officer stepped forward, using his height to try to intimidate. "Listen here, buddy, you don't get to make demands. Pop the trunk, or we'll have a problem." The word problem came out like a threat, sharp and deliberate. The chief felt a familiar weight in his chest, not fear, but a deep wariness mixed with determination. He'd been on both sides of this equation, and he knew exactly how power could corrupt judgment, how bias could cloud decision-making. "Officers, I want to be clear," he said, reaching slowly into his back pocket. "I'm going to take out my wallet again. Inside is my identification, not just my driver's license, but my law enforcement credentials." His movements were deliberate, telegraphed clearly to avoid any misinterpretation. The officers exchanged quick glances, their confidence wavering for just a moment. "Put your hands where we can see them," the shorter one barked, taking a half step back. "Now." "My hands are visible," the chief replied calmly, "and I'm reaching for my ID with your full awareness. As law enforcement officers, you should understand the importance of proper procedure during a traffic stop." His words carried the weight of authority, even as he maintained his role as the detained civilian. The night air had grown colder, and another truck rumbled past, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene. In that flash of light, he could see uncertainty beginning to crack through their aggressive facade. They were starting to realize that something about this stop wasn't quite what they'd assumed. "You trying to tell us how to do our jobs?" the taller officer asked, but his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. There was a note of uncertainty now, a slight wavering in his authoritative stance. The chief slowly withdrew his wallet again, his movements measured and calm. "No, officers. I'm simply a citizen expecting to be treated with the respect and professionalism that your badges require you to show." He paused, letting those words sink in. "And as your future chief of police, I'm very interested in how you conduct your traffic stops." The air seemed to freeze between them. The flashlight beam wavered, then dropped slightly. The second officer's hand finally moved away from his weapon. In the distance, another set of headlights appeared, growing larger as they approached. Neither officer spoke for a long moment. Their earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a dawning recognition that was almost painful to watch. The chief could see their minds racing, probably reviewing every word, every action, every protocol that ignored during the stop. But before either of them could respond, before the situation could resolve itself, those approaching headlights slowed and pulled onto the shoulder behind them. It was a familiar police cruiser, and the chief recognized the insignia of a lieutenant's vehicle. The night, it seemed, was about to become even more interesting. The lieutenant's cruiser came to a stop, its headlights adding to the surreal tableau on the highway shoulder. The chief watched in a reflection of his car window as both officers turned, their postures stiffening at the sight of a superior officer. The night had suddenly become very complicated for them. Red and blue lights still painted the scene in alternating colors, creating strange shadows on everyone's faces. The highway had grown quieter now, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for what would happen next. Even the occasional passing car seemed to slow down, drivers sensing that something significant was unfolding. "Everything all right here?" The lieutenant's voice carried clearly through the night air as he approached, flashlight pointed downward. "Proper procedure," the chief noted. Then came the moment of recognition. The lieutenant stopped mid-stride, his eyes widening slightly. "Chief." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. The two officers' heads snapped back toward their detained subject, finally understanding the gravity of their situation. The taller officer's flashlight dropped completely, while his partner took an unconscious step backward. "Good evening, Lieutenant," the chief replied calmly, still maintaining his position beside his car. "I was just discussing proper traffic stop procedures with these officers." His tone was professional, giving nothing away, but his eyes met the lieutenant's with meaningful intensity. The lieutenant removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. "Officers," he said, his voice carrying a mix of authority and disappointment, "would you care to explain why you have the incoming chief of police standing on the shoulder of the highway at 11 o'clock at night?" The silence that followed was deafening. The two officers looked at each other, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. The chief could almost see their careers flashing before their eyes, the write-ups, the disciplinary actions, the potential suspensions that they imagined were coming. We didn't know," the shorter officer stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The swagger from earlier had disappeared entirely, replaced by something close to panic. "We thought." "You thought what, exactly?" the chief asked, his voice level but firm. He stood up straight now, his full authority evident in his bearing. "That because of how I look or what I drive, I must be doing something wrong. That you could disregard proper procedure and basic respect because of assumptions." The taller officer's face had gone pale. "Sir, we can explain," he began, but fell silent, realizing there was no good explanation for what had transpired. The chief glanced at his watch, a simple timepiece his wife had given him for their anniversary. 11 minutes, he said. "That's how long you held me here without stating the reason for the stop. You conducted an unnecessary pat-down, made thinly veiled accusations about my vehicle, and kept your hands near your weapons despite my complete cooperation." The lieutenant had moved closer now, his presence adding weight to the chief's words. The wind had picked up, carrying the sound of distant traffic and rustling through the nearby trees. It was cold now, but none of them seemed to notice. "I've been on both sides of traffic stops for 20 years, the chief continued, his voice taking on a teaching tone. "I've trained officers, written procedures, and investigated complaints. But tonight, I learned more about our department than any report could have told me, and that's going to be valuable." The officers shifted uncomfortably, awaiting judgment. The lieutenant stood quietly. understanding that this moment was about more than just a traffic stop gone wrong. It was about systemic issues, about ingrained behaviors that needed to change. "Your badge numbers," the chief said, pulling out his phone, "are 4472 and 4589. You've violated at least 7 departmental procedures in the last 11 minutes. But more importantly, you've demonstrated exactly why I was appointed to this position." He looked at each officer in turn, his gaze direct but not unkind. "This isn't just about one traffic stop, or 2 officers, or even one department. This is about a way of thinking that needs to change. And starting next week, that's exactly what we're going to do." The lieutenant stepped forward. "Chief, would you like me to?" he began, but the chief raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No paperwork tonight, Lieutenant," he said, surprising everyone present. "But I want these officers in my office first thing Monday morning. We're going to have a long conversation about what happened here, and more importantly, about what happens next." He turned back to the 2 officers, whose relief at avoiding immediate discipline was tempered by the knowledge that this incident was far from over. "Sometimes the best lessons come from our mistakes," he said. "The question is, what are we going to learn from them?" The highway continued its nighttime rhythm around them, cars passing by unaware of the significant moment unfolding on the shoulder. The chief knew that this encounter would become a cornerstone of the changes he planned to implement, not as a story of punishment, but as a catalyst for transformation. The lieutenant's arrival had changed everything. Standing there on the highway shoulder, with red and blue lights still painting the scene, the 2 officers looked like they'd been dunked in cold water. Their earlier swagger had vanished, replaced by a mix of shock and dawning horror as the full weight of their actions settled in. We didn't." The taller officer started and stopped, words failing him. His partner had taken sudden interest in studying his boots, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The chief watched them both, seeing not just 2 officers who'd made a mistake, but a symptom of a larger problem he'd been hired to fix. The lieutenant cleared his throat. "Chief, I was heading back from the Harrison Street incident when I spotted the lights. I had no idea." He paused, glancing at the 2 officers. "This isn't how we wanted you to meet our night shift." A passing truck sent a gust of wind across the scene, ruffling papers and causing everyone to brace slightly. The chief looked at his watch again, nearly midnight now. His wife would be wondering where he was, but this moment was too important to rush. "Actually, Lieutenant," he said, straightening his jacket, "this might be exactly how I needed to meet them." He turned to the 2 officers, who seemed to be trying their best to disappear into thin air. "Your names and badge numbers are already in my memory. But what I want to know now is, what were you thinking during this stop? Be honest. This is your chance to explain." The shorter officer swallowed hard. We thought the car looked out of place in this area. Late at night," and he trailed off, realizing how weak the explanation sounded. "And?" the chief prompted, his voice firm but not angry. "Finish that thought, officer." A middle-aged black man in a Honda Civic looked out of place. "On a public highway? In the state where he's about to become your chief of police." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the highway seemed quieter, as if nature itself was listening to this impromptu midnight lesson in justice and prejudice. The taller officer finally found his voice. "Sir, we were wrong. Completely wrong. If we'd followed proper procedure, checked ID first." His voice cracked slightly. "We let assumptions guide our actions instead of training." The chief nodded slowly. "That's right. You did. And on Monday morning, we're going to have a long conversation about those assumptions. Not just with you 2, but with every officer on every shift." He paused, looking each man in the eye. "Because here's what concerns me most. You didn't just make mistakes in procedure. You showed me exactly what some of our citizens face every day." The lieutenant shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but understanding its importance. "Chief, should I start the paperwork for?" "No paperwork. Not yet." The chief's decision surprised everyone, including himself. Sometimes the best teaching moments come from our worst mistakes. And right now, these officers have my complete attention. He turned back to the 2 officers, who looked simultaneously relieved and terrified. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to finish your shift tonight, thinking about every second of this encounter. Every decision, every word, every assumption. Monday morning, 8 a.m. sharp, you're in my office. Not for punishment, for change." The taller officer straightened slightly. "Yes, sir, we'll be there." "And one more thing," the chief added, his voice taking on a tone of authority that made everyone stand a little straighter. "Tomorrow night, and every night after that, I want you to remember this moment. Remember how it felt to realize you judged someone based on nothing but appearances. Remember what it felt like to be wrong. And most importantly, remember how this moment could have gone differently if I'd been anyone else." The wind picked up again, carrying the distant sound of city life. The chief looked at his car, then back at the officers. "Lieutenant, I trust you can wrap things up here. Officers, I'll see you Monday morning, and I expect you to spend the weekend thinking about how we can turn this incident into something that makes our department better." As he walked back to his car, he could hear the lieutenant beginning to speak with the officers in low, serious tones. The chief knew this night would be a turning point, not just for these two officers, but for the entire department. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come wrapped in the most uncomfortable packages. Starting his engine, he caught a final glimpse of the scene in his rearview mirror. Two chastened officers, a concerned lieutenant, and the lingering red and blue lights that had started it all. Monday would bring changes, but for now, he had a story to tell his wife about why reform wasn't just necessary, it was personal. Monday morning arrived with a kind of clarity that only comes after a weekend of deep reflection. The chief sat behind his desk, a cup of coffee cooling beside him as he reviewed the dashcam footage from Friday night. The video told a story that needed to be shared, not to shame, but to change. At exactly 8 a.m., a knock came at his office door. The two officers from Friday night entered, their uniforms pristine, their expressions a mix of anxiety and determination. They'd clearly spent the weekend thinking about what had happened. It showed in their faces, in the way they carried themselves. "Sit down, officers," the chief said, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. "We have important work to do today." He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Send them in, please." The door opened again, and several more people filed in. The lieutenant from Friday night, 3 senior training officers, and the department's community relations coordinator. The two officers exchanged nervous glances as the room filled with their superiors. "I've called you all here because Friday night showed us something important," the chief began, standing up and walking around his desk. "It showed us exactly why I was appointed to this position and exactly what we need to change." He turned on the large screen on his wall, and the dash cam footage began to play. The two officers watched themselves on screen, their faces reddening as their actions were displayed for all to see. But the chief wasn't interested in shame. He had something else in mind. "Stop the video there," he said at a crucial moment. "Look at that approach. Look at the body language, the positioning, the unnecessary escalation. Now tell me, what should have happened differently?" To everyone's surprise, the taller officer spoke up immediately. "Everything, sir. From the moment we decided to make the stop, we were wrong. We let bias guide our actions instead of procedure." The chief nodded, encouraging him to continue. The officer straightened in his chair. "We should have stated the reason for the stop immediately. Our approach was aggressive, our positioning was threatening, and we created tension where there should have been none." "Good," the chief said. "Now, here's what we're going to do about it." He picked up a folder from his desk. "I spent the weekend developing a new training program. But it's not just about procedures and protocols, it's about understanding the impact of our actions on the community we serve." He laid out his plan. The two officers would become part of a new initiative, working directly with community leaders and citizens to understand their experiences. They would help develop new training scenarios based on their own mistake, teaching other officers what they'd learned. "This isn't punishment," the chief explained. "This is transformation. You're not being made examples of, you're becoming examples for change." The shorter officer raised his hand slightly. "Sir, if I may, I've been thinking about Friday night, about how many times I might have done something similar without realizing it, about how many people I might have." He paused, searching for words. "Hurt," the chief supplied gently. "Frightened? Made feel less than human." The officer nodded, his eyes showing genuine understanding. Over the next hour, they developed a plan together. The dash cam footage would become a training tool, but with the officers themselves leading the discussions, sharing their realizations, helping others understand before they made similar mistakes. The hardest part of change, the chief said, standing at his window and looking out over the city, is admitting we need it. You've done that. Now comes the work of making it happen. The training officers contributed their expertise, the community relations coordinator added insights about public perception, and slowly, a comprehensive program took shape. It wasn't just about traffic stops, it was about changing the entire culture of the department. As the meeting wound down, the chief had one final surprise. Your new assignments start today, he told the two officers. But first, there's someone I'd like you to meet. He opened his door, and an elderly gentleman walked in, the same man they'd given a hard time during a traffic stop 2 weeks earlier. This gentleman has agreed to be part of our community advisory board, the chief explained. He's going to help us understand how our actions affect real people in real situations. The two officers stood, facing the man they'd treated poorly, and something remarkable happened. Without prompting, they'd both offered sincere apologies. The elderly man nodded, accepting their words with dignity. Change, the chief said, watching this interaction, starts with understanding. It continues with action, and it only works if we're all committed to it. As everyone filed out of his office, the chief sat back down at his desk. Through his window, he could see the morning sun reflecting off the city buildings. His first official act as chief hadn't been what he'd expected, but sometimes the best opportunities for change come disguised as challenges. He picked up his phone to call his wife, knowing she'd want to hear about this morning's meeting. As he dialed, he smiled, remembering something his father used to say: true leadership isn't about avoiding mistakes, it's about turning them into stepping stones for progress. The department would change, not overnight, but day by day, person by person, action by action, and it would start with two officers who'd learned one of the most important lessons of their careers on a dark highway on a Friday night.